Joy's ready and you're ready to start the recording, we are good to go.
We are recording.
Thank you for joining us today for the AEM Center webinar, Coming to Terms, the Meaning of Accessible. I have the pleasure to kick off the webinar with some logistics and then to introduce my co-presenter and some other folks who are here today to support the delivery of the webinar. First, if you would like to view the closed captions, there's a closed caption button within Zoom. You select that, and then captions should be appearing along the bottom of your screen. And if you have any, any issues, I know somebody has already entered a question in the chat. Leslie O'Callaghan, who is our operations coordinator, will respond to you. Also, we'd love you to contribute to the conversation. There's no audio, so audio is muted, but we do encourage lots of activity in the chat. And if you're new to Zoom, which I know increasingly there are fewer and fewer people in the world who are new to Zoom, but if you haven't been in a Zoom room before, you select if it doesn't pop up automatically, there is a chat button in your Zoom menu bar. At the bottom of the chat box, make sure that you select to all panelists and attendees. So there's a blue box. It's a drop down. By default, I have found surprisingly, because it's not always this way, that it says to all panelists, and we will see it. So the panelists will see your comments and your questions, and that's fine if you want to send something just to us, but it's most helpful if you share your thoughts with everybody. So if you'd make sure that you select all panelists and attendees from that drop down, your comments and questions will be seen by everyone. And if you are a Twitter user, please use our handle at CAST, which is at @cast_UDL. And the hashtag that we use is AEM #4 all. This webinar will be recorded and it'll be available within a week or so. The link to that is a bit.ly, and it's AEM, all caps, terms in lowercase. And I also just wanted to add before we get underway that there's also a digital handout that goes along with today's webinar. And I know that Leslie has been dropping in the chat the link to both the webinar PowerPoint as well as that digital handout. You'll want the digital handout because that contains all of the links that go with the resources. So anytime we're referring to a resource, it is available through that digital handout that's on our website, which Leslie is dropping the link to in the chat. And we'll also update that handout post-webinar with other questions and resources that are brought up. So we will comb through the chat, we'll be taking notes, and we'll update that handout post-webinar. So I'm Cynthia Curry. It's my pleasure to co-present today with my colleague, longtime friend Joy Zabala. I'm director of the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials for Learning, and I also work closely with Joy on the Center on Inclusive Technology and Education Systems, both projects at CAST. Joy?
I'm Joy Zabala. I'm a former director of the AEM Center, and I am the principal investigator of the one that she just told you about that we'll talk about more in a moment. So it's very nice to be here with you.
Okay, so a little bit about CAST. So at the AEM Center at CAST. So CAST is a nonprofit organization. CAST is where, if you're familiar with Universal Design for Learning, it's where UDL was born, where it's been pioneered and continued to be researched and developed over time. Accessibility is foundational to Universal Design for Learning because UDL provides principles, guidelines, and checkpoints to support learners to become expert learners. And to become an expert learner, the entryway to that is to ensure accessibility. And we'll be, obviously as part of this webinar, we'll be talking about what accessibility means. We're looking forward to having this dialogue with you. The goal of the AEM Center is specifically around the materials part of UDL curriculum. So if UDL is about goals, methods, materials, and assessment, we're looking at accessibility of materials and the technologies that are used. So the AEM Center is all about working across the lifespan of education. So starting with early childhood, K-12, higher ed, workforce. We also work with families, and we also work in conjunction with EdTech developers and publishers, all to increase both the use and the availability of accessible materials and technologies to improve the learning outcomes for students with disabilities. We're funded by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, so our technical assistance is available at no cost. So if you have additional questions or need technical assistance as it relates to what we're referring to as accessibility, we encourage you to reach out. And as part of this webinar, we'll let you know how to do that. Joy, do you want to kick us off with the objectives?
Sure. I want to say a little bit about sites first, but Cynthia actually said the whole thing out, and it was so good I had to write it down for myself. The sites is we consider it sort of a sister project of AIM, because sites is the center on inclusive technology and education systems, and the goal of sites is to bring educational technology, information technology, and assistive technology into a single ecosystem where each has their own responsibilities, but they also have lots of places where it is most beneficial and for them to work together. So we work directly with districts. So with that said, you can see how much what happens with AIM makes a difference to sites, and hopefully vice versa. So the objectives for today are that to consider how and when to use the term accessible, and also to distinguish the term accessible from other disability related terms and other ways that people might use that word. So. You're muted.
Yep, thank you. So we have a poll to share with you. Leslie, would you launch that for us?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. This is to give us some background information about where everybody's experience is with accessibility, and from what definition of accessibility are you coming to this webinar? So there's no right or wrong answer, as in most polls. But we thought that this would be an interesting question to pose to the group. And it is, of the following, what are the top 2 features that make information accessible? And the choices are that information is free, that it's low cost, that it's easy to locate, that it's abundant, that everyone can acquire it, or that you yourself can acquire it, that everyone can interact with it, that you yourself can interact with it, it's available in print, and or it's available digitally.
So Cynthia, if I'm filling this out, I can select 2? I should select 2 things?
Top 2, yes.
Top 2, okay.
That is yes. So I think if I end it, I'll be able to display it in just a moment. I'll give everybody another 10 seconds or so. We know that this was a little bit more involved than a typical poll. All right, we still have some responses coming in, or people are changing their responses. Okay, so let's go ahead and display this. And everybody should be seeing that we have, let's see if we break this down, Joy. Looks like 74%, so the highest number of the highest percentage went to that everyone can interact with the information is what makes it accessible. And it looks like the second top choice was that everyone can acquire it. And then some other top choices were that it's free, that it's easy to locate, and it's available digitally. And the others got pretty much under 5, 6, 7% or less. What are your thoughts, Joy?
Well, let's see. It's free would be, it depends. Actually, I think the 2 that got the highest were really very much what we'd like to talk about. Exactly those things. how that works. But it's certainly understandable why people would sometimes think the others as well. So I would think that a lot of us would be very interested in hearing about the people who chose it's abundant, because we are working really hard for it to be abundant. So that's a very good thing.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if accessible materials and technologies were abundant?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that. Let's go back to our slide deck. So the first part of the webinar here is to talk about, is it really accessible? So there are two questions that we pose when it comes to determining if something's accessible. And of course, this is about equity. And equity comes in many different forms, and there are many different criteria. And that's why accessibility or accessible is often used interchangeably with other terms. So there are two questions that help get at what we refer to as accessibility at the AIM Center. And the first question, of course, is X available to every learner? So you can fill in X with anything that's relevant to you. You know, thinking about your own setting and whether it's information that you provide to your stakeholders, if it's a material, if it's a technology, is it an activity? And the question there is, can that X, whatever that may be, can it be delivered? Can it be put into the possession of those who need it in order to advance in whatever the goal may be? So this often is tied to things like the digital divide, which is caused by geographic reasons or socioeconomic reasons. And we're obviously seeing a lot of barriers to equity around availability today in terms of the homework gap before the school building closures. And now it's learning online, now it's learning remotely. And can we get materials and technologies, whether they're digital or print, to every learner who needs them? So that's one barrier to equity, is availability.
And Cynthia, you know, sometimes I've noticed that people will say, you know, that available, when they'll say available, but they use a different word, and they say, oh yes, it's accessible 24/7, which is this word, not that word.
Right. So you would suggest replacing the word it's accessible 24/7 to it's available 24/7.
Exactly. Right.
All right.
In
So,
our context, that's really important, which I think is your next question.
it is. So, and this would also be get at things like, you know, free, open, easy to find. So, you know, thinking about available in those terms, which really help to break down some of those barriers that relate to what we're seeing today in terms of equal access. When it comes to the term accessible and the way the AIM Center is concerned, and the way we want to help shape the conversation around accessibility, is once everybody successfully has in their possession what it is, what that X is, material, technology, an activity, whatever it may be, can every learner use it? And that's where we ask these follow-up questions around function. Because just being provided with the materials, technologies, or activity doesn't mean that every individual will be able to participate, will be able to interact. A lot of that is because we make some often assumptions about how that interaction happens, how functionally people will use the material or the technology, keeping in mind that not everybody uses, we're talking about technology, a keyboard, a mouse, or a trackpad, that there's a lot of variability in the way people interact with content. And so that's what we refer to as accessible. Go ahead, Joy.
And perception-wise, on the other end of it, how does one perceive that content, which certainly could be through the screen or in some other way. So we'll go into that a little bit more.
So here's a definition that we like to use at the AIM Center for accessible. It's from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. It can come across as a bit litigious because we pulled it from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and indeed, this definition came from a settlement agreement between the South Carolina Technical College and the Office for Civil Rights, and it has appeared in a lot of other places since then, which was 2013. But we like it because it does provide a really solid framework for making this decision about, is something accessible? And it is that a person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services in an equally effective, equally integrated manner, and with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. So we've set up this graphic on your screen for that definition, where everything that's the same, so that X, what is that technology, that material, the activity, the experience, is on the left side. So everyone can acquire it, they can engage in it, they can enjoy it. And then on the right side is how that is accessed. And the key phrases there are equally effective, equally integrated, and substantially equivalent ease of use. So it's not the same access, but it needs to be presented and provided in a way that doesn't add any additional burden to the user. That it needs to be, it could be an alternative to what others may be using, but it has to be as effective, it needs to be as integrated, and as easy to use. What would you add to this, Joy?
Well, Cynthia knows that I go a little bit nutty over the with substantially equivalent ease of use, because while we may be making a good bit of progress on something that's effective and integrated, we're still a long, long way from substantially equivalent ease of use a lot of times. And I think one of the things that comes up here is if you're using something different, because that's how you're going to provide this. We had a question at the AIM Center years ago saying, it seemed like it was like for driver's education or something, that they were using this one book, but they didn't, the book was not accessible to students, but they had this other one that was sort of like it, and it was accessible to students. So my response was, then maybe everybody could use that other one. So thinking about those kinds of things, and also just keeping in mind the difference between, if I want to say something, we want to hope that I thought about it first, and then I just opened my mouth and said it. Unfortunately for me, sometimes it's the other way around. But the notion of somebody who's using an augmentative communication device and and we're working on it substantially equivalent ease of use, I've got to think about it. I've got to find where it is on my device. I have to remember what it is that recalls what I'm going to say. And then I have to do whatever it is that makes it actually communicate that message. So it's fabulous that what can be done, but that substantially equivalent ease of use is something that we always have to have our eye on, because we can make some differences in the effectiveness. We can make some differences in how we integrate, even at the classroom or home or school level. But that equivalent of ease of use has to come, a lot of it, in the design.
Exactly, sort of that, and that's where some of the empathy being the first stage of the design thinking process, and how it's important for everybody who engages with people who use what we'll refer to as assistive technology in a moment, not to confuse accessibility and assistive technology too early here, but what Joy was just referring to as augmentative communication is that alternative means of accessing the same information, same interactions, and same services, but it's the design of the experience is typically not developed for somebody who uses an augmentative communication device. So the more we can, designers, whether it's technology designers or whether it's a publisher or whether it's educators, the better that we understand the way a variety of individuals interact with that X, materials, technologies, activities, experiences, I think the more likely we are going to be prepared either to design for them or to know how do we minimize any amount of burden on their ability to access the same. So please go ahead. I know we have some comments coming in the chat as well. I should have mentioned we have a couple of people, in addition to Leslie, we also have Brooke from Automatic Captioning Services here, and we also have Luis Perez in the chat as well. So just know that we have a lot of support at today's webinar. So thank you to you all. One of the ways that we like to determine whether something is accessible or not at the AIM Center. Part of our key technical assistance is a model for determining accessibility through the POUR model. And I know that there are a number of people here in the room that have used the POUR model before. So please, please feel free to be contributing in the chat of how you've used this model. But it's from the Worldwide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative, also known as the W3C Way. And that organization developed the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And those guidelines are pretty technical in nature. They're really developed for designers and developers of websites or digital materials to make them accessible. So what the W3C Way did was to develop this model that helps break down those technical standards into 4 more understandable concepts or standards, and these are perceivable or principles, and they're perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And conveniently, it makes the acronym POUR. So we like to say we're pouring on the accessibility. So let's walk through each one of those letters that make up the POUR model. The first being perceivable. When something is perceivable, it is made available or made accessible to individuals through multiple means, keeping in mind that the way somebody perceives something may be through seeing it, maybe through hearing it, maybe through feeling it. So the icon that's on the slide right now was developed by our designers at CAST, and it shows 4 different ways that information might be made accessible through perception, through making it more perceivable. So the first would be to make the information available through tactile means, and in this case, Braille. The image on the screen is of a book, but Braille can also be made refreshable and digital for refreshable Braille displays, for example, for somebody who can't see the text but can feel it through Braille. The next image is of a tablet that allows the display to be changed through enlarging the text size, changing the color contrast to make the content more perceivable. The next image is of a video playing on a screen, and the video is closed captions, so both the audio and the text are available. And the final image is of a smartphone that has alternative text being displayed and being spoken aloud by the built-in speech engine of the phone. And it's an image of water, and that alternative text is being spoken aloud. For operable, on the slide, again, there are 4 different ways that information or material can be made more operable. The first shows a table of contents in a book. And this book can be in print or it could be digital, but a table of contents helps form the structure of a document so that anybody who may be using different technologies to interact with that material can navigate it very easily. So if somebody can't see the book, but they may be using a screen reader, the screen reader can navigate easily when the book is structured through a table of contents, because the table of contents indicates that the book has headings, that it has lists, that it oftentimes will also indicate where there are diagrams. So somebody who is using a screen reader can jump around in that book. Same for somebody who may be using a switch. Somebody with a physical disability can navigate a book that has that type of structure much easily than a book that didn't have a table of contents with headers and page numbers. The next image that displays or conveys operable is another tablet or a smartphone, and it's being activated. A button on that screen is being activated through a finger, but it also is operable with, for example, a switch or with a screen reader. So a screen reader that speaks aloud what those buttons are for the user. The next is an accessible website on a monitor. So that website is tagged with accessible markup language, following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And then the 4th image is, again, of a smartphone. In this case, the smartphone is operable through speech recognition. So somebody can use their voice to operate that phone. All of these examples of operable. Understandable means that the content is intuitive, that it's consistent, that somebody can navigate it easily, it's predictable. So in this case, in that first book, the content is represented in two ways. So it could be text as well as Braille, text as well as digital text to speech, where this text is spoken aloud to somebody. A good example of this is in VoiceOver, which is the built-in screen reader for Mac OS, for the Mac operating system. And the screen reader VoiceOver allows somebody to both hear what the screen reader is saying, and there's also a bar that pops up along the bottom of the screen that conveys what the screen reader is saying in text, so people can work alongside each other. The next image shows a tablet that has the text that is conveyed in a very consistent logical pattern. There's another two examples of the desktop monitor as well as the tablet that shows language translation. And then finally, robust. So when something is robust, it means that it works across a lot of different devices, operating systems. So for, it works on a desktop, it works on a smartphone, it works on a tablet, works across Google, Apple, Microsoft, Android, you name it. And it also works with current and future technologies, as well as somebody's assistive technology. So it's robust in that it's interoperable across all kinds of contexts that we don't always consider. One of the ones that we don't consider often enough is that robustness in interoperability with assistive technology. So this is where Joy's going to pick up on what is this distinction between accessibility and AT.
Let's go forward. Great. So when we think about accessibility and assistive technology, sometimes there's a confusion that these are the same thing, or that if you have accessibility, you don't need assistive technology, or that assistive technology can't be something that's accessible. Lots of interesting pieces. But basically, accessible materials, technologies, and strategies look to make the entire learning environment as flexible and as accommodating as possible. That not just the accessible materials, while we're focusing on that, but also the goals and the methodology and all of the things that are being used, being that whole notion of flexibility and accommodating. And as Cynthia said with POUR, lots of different ways that information can be perceived and responded to. Assistive technology, on the other hand, looks at the specific barriers that an individual student may face in whatever environments they find themselves. Of course, if the environment is accessible and built and designed in that way, then some of the need for assistive technology may be lower for some students. But the key is that they work together to, and when both approaches are used, that it ensures that everyone can access, participate, and make progress within whatever goals they have. In education, we would say the general curriculum and their IEP goals or their 504 goals. But it really can go into all parts of life. So, Cynthia? So here's a little bit to look at, that when you're thinking about something that's accessible, it's really good for everybody. It's about choice. The user or someone on behalf of the user makes choices about what works for that user. There's flexibility so that there are lots of options to be used. It's really about also more than technology, even though the part we're talking about right now is focused on that technology. And there's built-in universal accessibility for all. The notion that, again, your design has made those multiple options available so that they can be manipulated. And it's also proactive. As Cynthia was talking, and as I said earlier, design is a critical issue. So very much like universal design for learning, you look at this accessibility piece. It's proactively looking at what in our materials and technologies could have barriers for some people, and how we can proactively lower those in the design process. Assistive technology, on the other hand, is individualized. It is really looking at the needs of one person at a time, even though it's great that assistive technologies often have some flexibility as well, but you're still looking at it as like Cynthia has a choice of something, but Joy doesn't have a choice in that same way. There's a particular setting in my accessible technologies that have to be turned on so that I can use them. So that very same piece of technology for me would be assistive, where for Cynthia, it would just be an accessible choice. It has to do with need, not to a specific disability category, but what is that about? It is required that it is provided in education when needed for an individual student to participate and achieve. It is an item that is very much related to functional capability. Again, not about a disability category, but how does the disability category that the person's in, how does the person's condition impact their functional capabilities, and how do we use assistive technology to mediate for where there is a separation? And the item or device is selected based on the features that are needed by an individual. And we would say that it is responsive rather than proactive. Proactive, we're lowering as many barriers as we can for everyone, building in as many options as we can. Responsively, there are still students who need more, and that would be their individual items, which would be their assistive technology. You're muted.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to point out, we have these two columns, accessible and assistive, but how important it is to note that when something is interoperable with assistive technology, that makes it robust. That's what makes it accessible, because I think sometimes there's a misconception that if somebody needs to use assistive technology to access something, then that something's not accessible. And how this, how this actually accessibility creates facilitates that interoperability with AT.
Right, and we used to say it can be used by everybody right out of the box, even though I haven't seen a box in years, I don't think. But then it could also be made usable with assistive technology. So you'd go to the next slide. So the point here is that interoperability piece, that assistive technology definitely broadens the usability of educational technologies if the educational technologies and software are designed and developed with those universal design principles that enable that interfacing to occur, meaning that they are designed to be accessible. And the more opportunity there is for those two things to work together, this is big, giant, robust in that pour, is absolutely critical, because if the interoperability is not possible, then you lose a whole bunch of accessibility. And I will tell you, this is another sort of a buried piece of the wording. We're talking about it accessible and available, but there's also this interoperability word. You might hear people talking about interoperability, and they're really talking about data systems. Data systems have sort of grabbed this word about interoperability as though it's their own. And what we're talking about here is interoperability between devices, and it's very important, just as important as that word is in data systems. So a couple of examples, Tyler in his science book, you'll notice as you look at this example, there's accessibility is built into the computer that he's using, into that operating system. And he may also have some accessibility features in his science book that make those two things work together for him. He's using the same science book everybody else is using. He's just using it in a slightly different way, perceiving it slightly differently and interacting with it slightly differently. Even though for him, you see that he doesn't need external assistive technology. What he needs is built in. So.
And Joy, I just wanted to add on to your description of Tyler and his science book is that there's the video that goes with this that Leslie just dropped in the chat. And this video demonstration goes back to 2009, I believe. So Tyler was a student at the middle school that I used to teach at years and years ago. And the laptop that he's using is an iBook, and it's an Apple iBook that dates back to, I'd say 2007, maybe 2008. As part of the Maine Learning Technology Initiative's one-to-one rollout of laptops in the early 2000s through about 2012 or so. And Tyler was demonstrating. I highly recommend looking at that video. Like I said, this is from 10 years ago that this built-in accessibility was available, and how we really need to be digging into all of these tools and materials that developers are putting out, because they are increasingly accessible and have these features built into them, even more robustly and in more interoperability than 10 years ago.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So the key takeaway from what Joy and I have walked through, from what makes something available versus something accessible, the definition of accessible from a functional standpoint, from the Office for Civil Rights, to things that are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, to the distinction between accessible and assistive technology and how that relates to interoperability. The key takeaway that we have is that accessibility leads to the same materials, or access to the same materials, the same technologies at the same time and for all. And Joy, one of the favorite terms, phrases that you use that stays with me is that it's accessibility for all, assistive technology for some. And of course, before that is the availability. Availability is key, that unless something is made, yeah, to have it, but when something's made available, everybody needs to be able to use it in order to be independent, to make progress, to participate.
Right.
So with that, we have some time for discussion. And Joy, one of the things that was coming through the chat, which maybe you've seen since you were talking about the slide that had the side-by-side distinction between accessible and assistive, was how many people really appreciate that slide. And I just wanted to remind everybody that the AIM Center provides no-cost technical assistance, meaning that all of our resources are free and open for the taking. So please, if you found that useful, Joy, I think they have your permission to reuse that.
Absolutely. I think the one of the things that I think is interesting about that slide, though, because it almost makes it look like it's either this or this. And remember, when you use it to think about, there it is again, when you use it to think about that accessible thing for all, may for one be something that is assisted, meaning that Cynthia has 5 ways she can write. And so that technology that gives her 5 ways to choose from is wonderful. Me, I have only 1 way I can write, and it's in that accessible technology. But since I have to have those features on for the technology to work for me, it needs to be in my service plan, that I need that kind of feature in order for it to work, even though what the item is just right there in the environment for use by everybody. So that, I know that can be sticky and tricky, but the 2 divisions here are great, but remember that sometimes the line blurs between them.
And that goes back to the interoperability as well, because you need that assistive technology across environments and across tasks. So not just for instruction, but also for assessments. If you are going to provide valid and reliable evidence of what you know and what you can do, you need the same access. So these features can't be turned off, or the access to these features or interoperability can't be turned off in some settings and on in others. Depending on, of course, on a lot of different factors, but typically if we're looking to determine what students know, what they can do, and to ensure that they can be independent, they can participate and make progress, accessibility and assistive technology need to work together across all of those settings and tasks. including remote learning. So that's the situation that that we're currently in. How important it is for teachers, students, and families to know how to find the accessibility within these within the materials and technologies that are being made available.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's hard out there is that, you know, people who are more knowledgeable about or thinking about these kinds of things a lot will go and look for those features and where they're located. Where if someone is fairly new to this, they may not even know to go and look for what the options are. And this is not new. This has been going on for a long, long time, but we need to be sure that we help people understand that there are features that increase accessibility. One of my goals, and it's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but one of the things I would like to see is not accessibility features, but just features. These are the features that are in here. And of course, some of them are very directly related to accessibility, but remember that accessibility is for all. So everybody should have the opportunity to know what those are, turn them off, turn them on. Sometimes it's not even turn them off, turn them on forever. It's situational. It can be, I'm on the bus now and I need to wear my earphones and hear my materials read because I'm going to be here a while. So that may be my preference.
That's such a good point. We're going to jump into the chat in a moment because there are some comments and questions that have come in. But having been a science teacher, so I was a middle school and high school science teacher, one of the things that I'm always on the lookout for, being so entrenched right now in accessibility for individuals with disabilities, is to not forget that a lot of students with disabilities are being guided to these features and being shown how that interoperability works with assistive technology, and how we can't assume that all students are going to discover these features that allow them varied ways to perceive the information, varied ways that they can interact with the content. And if these features are really built in and part of the design, how it's so important for all students to be introduced to them. And I think that's often overlooked. A lot of times, teachers don't know that these exist. So there are some good comments that have come in. And I know that Luis is tracking this as well. I don't know, Luis, if you want to choose.
Yeah, there was
between the comments and the questions.
There was a good question that came in, and I'll just read the question and I'll let the two of you comment on it. If we are creating or have created a presentation, is there a checklist to consider to make sure we're making it accessible? So could you address that issue of a checklist? Because that comes up a lot.
Yes, Luis, I can, because you helped develop it. And this is perfect because there is a resource within the digital handout for today's webinar. On the AIM Center website, we have a section on creating accessible documents and slide decks. And in the digital handout for today's webinar is a link that goes directly to that section of the website. And the AIM Center just last month delivered a webinar on this topic of creating accessible documents. And that's archived on our website as well.
And I just popped that into the link for those of you who want to copy and paste it.
Of course you did. Thanks, Leslie.
And then this one's for Joy. UDL is often claimed it's for people with disabilities, and accessibility gets mixed in. Do you have a quick analogy to explain both?
Gosh, I wish I knew what that quick analogy was. You got one, Luis? The whole notion, going back historically with universal design for learning, yes, in the very beginning, it was a way to think about technology being used to broaden the educational experience and enrich the educational experience of students with disabilities. But it was very quickly found that that particular type of design was beneficial for everyone. And yes, accessibility is a key part of that design. I guess for me, the analogy would be, we created curb cuts for people in wheelchairs, and yet curb cuts are used by everyone. The one that I think is most interesting is if you look back at when curb cuts were required and when suitcases with wheels became ubiquitous in the environments, there's some really close connection there, because curb cuts, I can pull my suitcase right up. I can roll the baby carriage. I can use my bike. I can, not my skateboard, but a skateboard can go up and down. So I think that to think about something that was created for some and is used by all, and of course with universal design for learning, that was a really quick change from, oh, it's for this group of people, and yet now really it truly goes by its name, universal. You start there with everyone and make that environment as accessible and inclusive as possible. And then you add assistive technology so that everybody can participate and benefit from that universally designed environment. How's that? Luis, are you still there?
I'm here. That sounds good to me, Joy. I'm here. I'm looking at one of the questions that came in. This is a really provocative question in light of the current context. What job title would you use now for those of us working on as an assistive technology specialist? Accessibility coaches?
It's a thought.
Gosh, that is. And I think, well, and this actually, I think, fits really nicely, Joy, with the AIM Center, but also with CITES, with the Center on Inclusive Technology and Education Systems, because what CITES is aiming to do is to support developing inclusive technology ecosystems through teaming, through collaboration, through coordination, that we need these cross-functional teams within systems. In the case of CITES, we're working specifically with school districts, but making sure that it doesn't necessarily matter as much what your title is, as much as what is your role and responsibility within that system in making sure that the technology is inclusive. So everything from the infrastructure to learning opportunities for educators and for families, that the guidelines and policies support inclusive technology uses throughout the school district or the state, depending if you're at the state level or in a higher ed institution. So the settings change, but those roles and responsibilities for ensuring access through what we're referring to as accessibility, I mean, the system needs to work together. So the roles and responsibilities need to be defined, regardless of what your title may be.
Yeah, and I don't know if the person who asked that question knows that I have a terror of the term expert in assistive technology, because even when you've been doing it for a long time, like I have, there are so many things changing that the expertise in the tools becomes almost elusive, if not totally elusive. And so I guess I would rather have, if you must use assistive technology facilitator or something like that. I do like the accessibility coach notion, or having the big umbrella of accessibility being in the title rather than assistive, which automatically pulls it to a different place.
It could be, Joy, but what if somebody doesn't have these? Maybe they really do have a lot of expertise on accessibility of materials and technologies. How do you identify whether something is accessible? You could identify whether something, maybe based on the web content accessibility guidelines and other resources that are available, somebody may be able to determine that a material is going to be interoperable with assistive technology, but they may not have that assistive technology expertise in terms of match. Yeah, yep.
Right. It is a conundrum because one of the things that as we try to let me go back. In CITES, the notion is not to blend in a way that the carrots and the kale and the oranges are blended, where you can't pick any of them out, but rather how they work together and overlap, and to increase that overlap so that everybody does have a role and responsibility. But let's take, for example, if people are really working hard to think about accessible technologies, then the person with some more assistive technology background needs to be able to say, all right, what's the payoff if it's accessible, if it's more accessible? And the payoff, of course, is in student ability to use and proceed, but maybe the person who asked that question about interoperability. So there's really lots of, it's important to have someone with knowledge and skills in assistive technology, but a lot of them may be more focused on process than they are on the actual overview of the 10,000 things out there that could potentially be considered assistive technology. And of course, the notion of any item, you know, that's any item is any item. And so but I think the key thing that we're looking for here, not to go into a whole assistive technology thing, is that the more accessible everything that's used by everyone is, the better it's going to be for everybody. The fewer additional modifications or accommodations that you will need to make if what you are seeking in the first place and consuming, there's a tremendous benefit from the highest possible level of accessibility. You look puzzled, Cynthia. You have a different...
No, I'm waiting. Well, I'm no, I think that was terrific. And then Jan, I guess I'm going to just sneak this question in Louise, just because it came in, and just to continue what you were just describing, Joy. The question or this question: do you see the AIM specialist as part of instructional technology team or assistive technology team, or both? And I think we both enthusiastically
both say both.
Absolutely, a perfect question. It is both, because in order for, going back to, I'm going to go back to that definition. I know we have just a few minutes left, and we want to share some more information with people about some events that are happening. But when you look at this definition of accessible, the same information, the same interactions, the same services, that's really about everyone. And that's where your team comes in, because oftentimes general education, IT, they're not thinking, because they don't have the background perhaps, about the varied ways that lots of different people interact with these materials and technologies. So that's where the cross-functional roles come in, because on the right-hand side, equally effective, equally integrated, substantially equivalent ease of use, that needs to be determined with some people who have that background of having worked with people who experience other ways of interaction that don't necessarily include the traditional keyboard, mouse, trackpad. So it has to be both. It has to be people coming together and working together, combining their expertise, not blending, as Joy said, because we don't want to lose the importance of the individual needs. But it needs to be, we need to be sharing our expertise in order to support everyone.
So I think one of the things that is, obviously this is a devastating time. This is not an easy time for anybody. But one of the things that we've seen that has been a really exciting thing, and I would expect that a lot of you have experienced the same thing, that as people are looking at how do we serve students and families and other educators in this very strange time when the environments are so radically different than they were 3 months ago, let's say, and likely to be fairly radically different for a while, is the fact that people who really hadn't thought too much about how important it was, this collaboration across technology, that now that not everybody, but lots and lots and lots of people are using it, and we see technology as a major part of our emergency distance learning, there's a lot more discussion between those groups. And of course, for the SITES project, that's just really exciting to see. We never, ever had the notion that we would have an amazing experiment that said, is it valuable for these three groups to work together and not be siloed into their individual place. And I think too, because we are coming close to the end, to really think about that word accessibility. And remember way back in the beginning when we were talking about accessible being different than available. And the more that we can model that usage, those words, the more other people will also think about those differences.
Mm-hmm. And just how critical it is, the availability certainly needs to come first. But once that availability succeeds, so students who are in areas geographically where they don't have connectivity, students who are in socioeconomic situations where they don't have the same access to devices as their peers, that obviously is essential for students, whether they're in K-12 or higher ed or any other environment, anybody who's in a learning situation, in order to continue to make progress. The availability is key, but as part of that availability, these considerations around access, for everybody, the functional definition of accessibility, and keeping in mind that the individuals, the professionals who were in the buildings before they closed, and students were sent out to their homes, those professionals are no longer there. So those professionals who used to be in the building, being able to grab a worksheet and scan it and get it to the student, those people who were able to help troubleshoot a student's assistive technology, obviously they're remote. And this just shows how important it is to build the training and the independence of teachers, students, and families to be able to be independent with their accessible materials and technologies, knowing that those are a priority within the provision of materials and technologies for learning, as well as the AT.
Yes.
So going further, please take some time. We're just starting this discussion. As we said at the beginning, the AIM Center is a technical assistance center funded by the Department of Education to provide assistance around accessibility, increasing both the use and the availability. So to that end, we have a number of resources on our website. We've chosen some that are really most relevant to this topic about the definition of accessible. So AIM and the Digital Shift, which was part of the description for today's webinar. Is it accessible? Questions to ask, and best practices for educators. I know Leslie has been dropping links to these specific pages within the chat, and also they're in the digital handout for today's webinar. We're also offering virtual office hours. The first is at 4:30 today, so just about 33 minutes away if you want to continue this conversation at 4:30. The link was made available within the description of the webinar. Also dropped it here, and I think Leslie will drop it in the chat. And then we also have an office hour every Thursday at 4:30. And these office hours are for any topic related to accessible materials and technologies. There will be an AIM Center staff person at these office hours. And there's also an opportunity to be an AIM State. So the AIM Center is offering five states to be part of an AIM cohort. It's free technical assistance to create accessible educational material provision systems within your state. So working with your state education agency, together with your local education agencies, but also working as an interagency collaborative with early childhood, higher ed, workforce, and families. So it's a really comprehensive technical assistance program. The application deadline is July 1st. It was originally May 1st, but we extended it due to the crisis. Details are on our website, and you'll find that link again in the digital handout. And a reminder on some of our upcoming webinars. So next week at this time is, actually tomorrow at this time is a SITES webinar on coordination. We're all in this together. And then next Monday at this time is a webinar on captioning your own videos. 2 weeks from today is, or I'm sorry, next Tuesday, there is a second SITES webinar on continuity. Joy, do you want to speak to that briefly?
Just quickly, the notion of the continuity we looked at first, what was working when we were in buildings and what can be transferred to now. And I think we're still doing some of that work, but we're also looking at what do we have the opportunity to learn during this, that when this is over, whatever that means, we know what's of value to carry on. So the continuity there. So what do we do to think about how we would have those conversations at the time when we're back to having to make a little bit more critical choices, where now we have a lot of opportunity to try lots of things. What makes the cut to go back? What perhaps doesn't?
This is a really process-oriented webinar, and again, the decision-making process is part of your as part of a team, and you have guests.
We do
these webinars.
Yes, and we also do for tomorrow with the coordination piece, where we're looking at what do Tech Act states have to offer. Tech Act programs. What do parent centers? How do all of these pieces work together so that people, families and students and educators have what they need.
Great. And then June 1st, features, we're going to have a features and accessibility series at the AIM Center, where we invite vendors to join us along with some users of their products, focusing on, not necessarily the product as much as what are the features that support teaching and learning. So on the first, we have Microsoft. If you know Mike Thulfson, he's going to be co-presenting with Alice Wright, who's an AT specialist in Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland. On June 8th, curating accessible OER, open educational resources with Confident. So we have a protocol for evaluating OER specifically for accessibility. And then on June 15th, we're wrapping it up with personalizing the writing experience, which is a nice counterpart to our personalizing the reading experience. So please stay connected. All of our connection information is also in the digital handout. We welcome you to reach out to us for lots of different reasons, in addition to how do you make something accessible. But having these bigger conversations around what does accessibility mean, so that we can have these conversations as a community with others who may be interchanging the term accessibility with something like availability or accommodations or adaptability.
So what are some other words that need to be in this series? So definitely, if you think of those, pass them in somewhere.
There are a lot of A's in there, aren't there? And well, of course, we appreciate your feedback. And I'm sure that that Leslie has dropped the link to the survey for today's webinar in the chat.
Yes, I have.
Thank you. And your feedback helps us to continue improving our webinars over time. So thank you very much for taking a few moments to do that.
Thank you very
Joy,
much.
Last words.
Last words is we got to get out of here. We're going to be in trouble. So
okay.
Thank you very much, people, for the time that you spent with us this afternoon. And we hope you have some valuable things to take away.
Thank you, everyone.